Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Conscious Grief Series 5. And today I am joined by grief educator Kim Hinchey. Welcome, Kim.
Hi, thank you.
So good to have you on this series, Kim. And we met quite sort of randomly. You came on a Tea with Tara call, and I didn't know who you were, and I didn't know what you did, but I was very touched by what you shared about how grief has transformed you. And this is a summit about transformation and how we can turn pain into something where we can evolve and grow from. And you have quite a story of how you came to work in this space. So maybe you'd like to begin by telling us a little bit about your husband and your son and their deaths.
Okay. I would say that I had a pretty normal life as far as the American dream. I was very focused on money and material possessions, and I was a workaholic. I worked all the time. My adult son, Adrian, was living with my husband, John, and I. He had been living with us since he got clean from his addiction. And then COVID happened. And so he was still living with us. And he had a relapse and died of an accidental overdose. So that is every parent's worst fear, as we know. And we were crushed. John and I were absolutely destroyed. I've mentioned to you that he and John had a very turbulent relationship. And so there was a lot of regret and guilt with John after Adrian died that I probably didn't feel the extent of that. And he died of a heart attack about 3 months later. So my entire world was just exploded. It was over, everything. And I had to decide if I was going to change or if I was just going to sit and stagnate in this circle of rage and sadness that I found myself in.
Well, firstly, I'm so sorry, to lose your son and your husband within months of one another.
Yeah.
And I know that it was while you were doing the grief educator program that you kind of had a bit of a sort of aha moment in your grief.
Yes, I say non-ironically that David Kessler saved my life because when I found him and his teachings, things started to kind of fit together, the puzzle pieces. And I was a member of his group, his grief group, and then, yes, became an educator, a grief educator certified through him. What happened to me is that I realized that grief wasn't going to go away. In the beginning, I was just waiting for it to stop. I was thinking I have gotten through everything else in my life by just pushing on and just stiff upper lip and just keep going. And I was very shielded person. I had walls that were 100 feet high, and I didn't see any reason to change that as I was in grief. I really rebuffed a lot of friends and family that wanted to be there in support of me, but I was like, no, I'm just going to do this alone. I'm just going to soldier through it. I will get through this. And then there came the day when I realized, and it really was a light bulb moment for me, when I realized this isn't going to end. It's not. It's not something I just have to wait a certain amount of time before it's over. I don't have to just concentrate on other things or keep myself busy. Adrian's not coming back, and John's not coming back. And the person that I was before they died is not coming back. And it was really a light bulb moment for me. So I had to decide what I was going to do at that point. And pushing into the grief was the only answer. I had heard people talk about doing the work, and I didn't understand what that meant. I really didn't. How do you work on grief? And I had heard people say you have to go through it to get through it. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. But it's true. Both of those things are true. You really do have to push into the grief. You have to feel the feelings as they come up, and you have to go through it. I feel like grief that is ignored is like a wound that becomes infected, and eventually you develop like an abscess. It's just this painful spot that you try not to touch, but eventually it needs attention. So I discovered that by allowing myself to feel all of the feelings as they came, that spot didn't become infected. It still hurt worse than anything, but it didn't become infected. And the pain was shorter. The grief waves were less. And I was able to start thinking about my loved ones in a way that wasn't just about their death. And that was really a turning point for me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. You know, I was just thinking about how we do have these sorts of terminology, like working on the grief or holding space, and, you know, for people who've never been in these kind of therapeutic settings, it is like this whole other language. Like, what does this mean? What are people talking about? And I was thinking, like, you know, you talked about you felt the feelings. Did you go and do retreats? Did you have a therapist? Like, just thinking of, you know, like how you kind of supported yourself in that time.
I attended grief groups. I did have a therapist. I didn't go to any retreats. They died during COVID, so there weren't any in-person retreats. But I did discover Zoom and how you can connect with people. And I think that's a kind of a weird silver lining, because you can connect with other people. And when Adrian first died, I thought, well, there's no groups, there's nowhere to go. And then I realized that I could be on a Zoom meeting in my bed with my hoodie on in the dark in my safe space. And that was really like a blessing, because I didn't have to think about going out. I was incapable of going out for a really long time. I was just afraid of everything. And the world outside that front door was terrifying. So yeah. And so attending grief groups online was really my peer-to-peer support, I would say.
And I also think the other amazing thing about Zoom is, you know, and you described yourself in your hoodie and on your bed, and it's like you're not in an actual room with people, so you have the mute button. So if you need to like cry and wail and blow your nose and make all kinds of sounds, you can. And there's something so freeing about that as well, which, you know, we may not feel to do when if we were in an actual room with one another, because we talk so much about, oh, it's so nice to be together in real life. And yes, it is. But, you know, I teach breathwork classes, and there's an opportunity to have like a big scream in that. And I've done breathwork in rooms with other people, and I didn't like it because I didn't like hearing their sounds. I didn't like me expressing my sounds.
Yeah.
So actually, Zoom is really quite powerful in that way.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Switching gears slightly, Adrian's death is a death from addiction. And this is a kind of taboo sort of type topic in some way. Like, it can be a very difficult thing to speak about, but it's, you know, happening in an insane level, especially in the United States. And
the fentanyl epidemic.
And this is, you know, we had a quick chat before we started the interview, and there's a lot of like judgments around addiction and death by addiction. So perhaps you could share with some of the listeners, who have been affected by this, or people who haven't, but, all of this sort of stigmas around this kind of death.
Sure. Well, you can't talk about addiction without talking about mental health, because they go together. They are peanut butter and jelly in the grief world. If you can show me someone who has addiction problems, who has no mental health issues, that's like showing me a unicorn, because it doesn't exist. They go together, and neither one is really talked about openly or without that taboo. I used to think that it would be better for Adrian if he had cancer, because when people have cancer, everyone rallies around, as they should. I'm not trying to take away from that at all. They rally around, and there's a lot of support and sympathy for the family, and you just don't see that usually with addiction. It becomes, instead of saying, whatever we can do for you, it becomes, well, are you giving them money? Are you showing them tough love? Are you all of these things that are extremely difficult? It's not easy to show tough love to your child, nor am I convinced that it's the thing that we should be doing. If someone who has cancer goes into remission, everyone is like, oh, that's so wonderful. It's just great. You keep it up. When my son quit heroin cold turkey, no one congratulated him. No one said, wow, that is amazing, because it was. They just were like, well, good, finally, and waited for the relapse to happen. So there's this entire viewpoint about addiction that is really, it's stigmatized, and it's really difficult, especially for people who love addicts, because we know that's not all they are. They're not the addiction. That's just the demon that's riding them. That's not the person. Adrian was brilliant, and he was so funny, and he was just the best person to be around. He was one of my best friends, and the addiction was the disease that tormented him. It was not him. So it's really difficult being someone who loves an addict who has died, or being someone who loves someone with mental illness who has died, maybe by suicide, because it's stigmatized. And then there's the secretism that comes up. They become like this bad secret. Nobody wants to talk about them, and they're still your very loved person who is gone, and you want to talk about them. You want to, but they become just like this subject that people avoid, and that's incredibly painful and isolating.
It really, truly is. And thank you for sharing a little bit about who Adrian was.
He was wonderful.
Yeah, because again, I think that's another part of the addiction becomes the person, and all the destruction and the pain and that goes with addiction that, the rest of the family have to contend with. But ultimately, and I had a wonderful therapist, and I had a friend who was an alcoholic, or is an alcoholic, and but I always remember her saying, addicts are often the best people. Yeah, they really are, because that's
true.
Often the most vivacious, or the deep thinkers, the feelers. And I'm not saying this is what happened to your son, because it's not, but a lot of the time that we turn to substances is because life is so painful. And
that is what happened to Adrian in the end, for sure, because it was during COVID, and he couldn't do anything. He couldn't go anywhere. He couldn't work. He couldn't go to school. He was just stuck in the house day after day. And his mental illness, which he did have issues, it just grew. And then that's when he relapsed. So yes, I think the world was too much for him.
Yeah. And this is the thing with the world right now, actually, that it's still a lot for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And they're sensitive people, and like you say, this tough love uh, part is a really
Mhm.
tricky one, isn't it?
It is.
Mm.
And I I understand where it's coming from, but I think it's not always going to work. In fact, I doubt it works very often. That's just my own personal opinion. There could be people who are saying, oh no, it worked for me or for my loved one. And that's wonderful if that was a success. But it was not going to work for me and my son because it was contrary to everything that I believed about being a mother and loving him as he was. I was incapable of doing the things that I was told to do. Cut him off. Don't talk to him. Ignore him. Don't give him any kind of support. And I do recall him saying to me, Mom, I would have died a long time ago if it wasn't for you, because he knew that he and a lot of his friends had died who were on the streets or, living in really different, dangerous situations because their families had cut them off. So I'm not trying to pass judgment at all on people who choose to do that because we don't know what to do. We don't. We do the best we can with whatever tools we have at our disposal.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just tragic.
It's tragic and it's really almost impossible a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, it really is.
And then I know that we were talking about the sort of Facebook support groups and then the little comments that people make about, the comparing, which people do like to get into in all kinds of grief. But this especially, you found a lot of judgment in some of these groups.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's just indicative of how our culture does view addiction as this bad thing, as a shameful bad thing instead of as the illness that it is. So the fentanyl epidemic is absolutely horrifying, and some of the groups that I belong to in the beginning, that were like parents who had lost a child to overdose. It was sometimes 10 people would join every day. And that's 10 children who had died from fentanyl or something else. But what I saw happening was people would be quick to explain, my child wasn't an addict. My child wasn't a junkie. They just took a pill. This was their first time ever using drugs, which they don't know that, but that would be, something that they would say. And they were quick to like make it them and us and draw that line that, look, my kid was a good kid. My person was a good person. They only died because somebody gave them something laced with fentanyl. And that is tragic. It's horrible. But my son was a good person. My son was a wonderful person. And it's equally tragic that he died from an overdose after addiction. So it's that weird stigma thing again of addiction and mental illness that's, well, my kid was normal, my kid was a straight A student, my kid was involved in sports, my kid was very popular. I've seen all of those things posted. And I get it that it's a way of coping at the moment, but grief is grief.
Grief is
And it can be really hurtful to someone who loves an addict who has lost their loved one reading that, well, my kid wasn't a junkie. That's an offensive word, and I've seen it more than once. So it's really, really hard. But we need to talk about it like this.
We do. We do.
Yeah.
Be other people who are, experiencing similar things and
Yeah.
to release these judgments. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then 3 months after Adrian died, Your husband had a sudden heart attack.
Yes, he did. And I found Adrian when he died, and then I also found John, and the circumstances were eerily similar. It was like going through a nightmare again. The same police came, the same coroner came, everything was the same. And yeah, I really did feel like I was just reliving this nightmare all over again. But at the close of that day, my husband was gone, who was the only person who understood what I was going through. And I was alone in this echoing house with neither of them. And that's when I got really angry. I was in rage. I was just put those walls up, circled myself with my fury, hated the universe, hated everyone who had a normal life and a normal family. I was very, very angry. And it wasn't until later, when it was David Kessler who told me anger is a legitimate form of grief. And I didn't realize that, but it fit because that was how my grief looked. That then it was anger, and my grief has looked a lot of different ways since then. But I recognize it now that grief has so many different faces. It's not those 5 stages that we hear about. That's no, grief can look like numbness. It can look like sorrow. It can look like laughter. It can look like rage. It can look like so many different things. And we just have to feel them as they come and accept them, that this is just the way they are. This is what my grief looks like right now. I spent a lot of time saying that to myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you explained that you described yourself, as having the typical American sort of lifestyle, that you're very much a workaholic, a material things very important.
Yep.
And how has this immense loss and grief changed you?
I think the biggest change has been in those emotional walls that I talked about. I think we've talked about this before, that I discovered strength was not what I thought it was before. Before, I would have counted strength as being able to soldier through, to just, put on that stiff upper lip, just do it, just get it done, just get through it. And those walls, those emotional walls that were just so thick and wouldn't let anybody in and wouldn't let my feelings out. And then there came the day that I realized that true strength, at least for me, was in feeling and being vulnerable. Like, this is strength. Being able to cry and hug people and talk about how I really feel. It's so much harder than putting up those walls, where there's no risk. And being able to be vulnerable and just genuine with people, that is where I've found strength really is it's not at all what I used to think. Mm-hmm. So that's been a huge part of my life, has changed. I have changed. I say that to clients all the time. You will not be going back to that person who you were before. You won't. It doesn't mean that you're going to be feeling this way forever, because you won't. No feeling is final, right? But you will not be going back to the pre-death version of yourself. Mm. That person doesn't exist anymore. So I've become this softer, more authentic. I love people, and I'm willing to say, I love you, and just be really genuine. And I'm not ashamed of my feelings at all anymore. In fact, I want to share them more with people so that other people are encouraged to share their feelings. And I would have laughed at all of this before. I call it the before times. I would have laughed. I would have been like, oh, that's just ridiculous. Honestly, you don't have to talk about your feelings all the time. But there's so much freedom in living this way. There's so much freedom and healing. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, it's really a powerful, powerful testimony listening to that. It really is. You said something earlier when you said, the strength of it takes a lot of strength, a lot of courage to be vulnerable. And you said to take the risk. And what would have been the risk of being vulnerable for you?
Well, I lived behind those walls my entire adult life and probably much of my childhood as well. So letting them down was really frightening. What are people going to think was really frightening. What are people going to say? Are people going to let me down? And yeah, probably. That's part of being vulnerable. Probably people will let you down, but then you're going to find people that you never expected in the places you never would have dreamed of looking. And those are the people who aren't going to let you down, you're going to form new relationships with people that maybe you didn't have anything that you would have had in common before. But I've made really good friends, through grief, which sounds so strange, but I've made really good friends that I count among the people that I would call them my support people, even people that I haven't met face to face. I've only met them through Zoom. And it's frightening. It's frightening. It is, to be vulnerable, but it's baby steps, right? You don't just go out there into the middle of the street and say, this is how I'm feeling today. It can start with just telling a friend, I'm not okay. I'm not okay, because that's honest and it's authentic and you don't have to pretend. Mm-hmm. And that is the first step, is the scariest. That is when you feel vulnerable, but then you realize how freeing it is and how good it is and how it just lightens your heart and your spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that's a progression itself too. The more you take those steps, and the lighter your heart gets, the lighter your spirit gets, the easier it gets, and the more light and healing comes into your life. It really does work that way.
It does.
But if somebody had told me that in the beginning, I wouldn't have believed it. Yeah. I had to try it, and it does work. Yeah.
And take the risk and know, yes, like what you said, you found beautiful new friendships and new relationships, but there will be people from your old life that can't handle that.
Yeah. And maybe they shouldn't have to.
Yeah.
Maybe we expect too much from people, because grief is all consuming for us. When someone you love deeply dies, that's your focus. And I think sometimes our expectations are a little bit too high for other people, because they're the same person they were before. So, and their life hasn't changed. So maybe we have a little bit too high of expectations for them. For some people, that's not going to be true of everyone. There are people from my old life who are still here and present, but there are others that have drifted off, and I've learned to let them go with love and just wish them the best. And I know something is going to come to replace them. I know that now. But it was lonely at first, really lonely.
Yeah, it's really, really wise words, Kim. And I think there are just sort of some people that can't hold the space, and that's, like you say, they're still the same person. You are a different person. Yeah.
And you can't really expect them to be a different person because of your life change and your loss. I've heard the term more than once. It's like going to the hardware store for milk. It's the wrong place to seek support. You can find support, but it might not be in your friends, your old friends. It might not be your closest family members. One thing that's definitely true is children don't like to see their parents in grief. Children don't like to see their parents in any kind of unhappiness. Even when we're adults, it just stresses me to see my mom cry. And so I think sometimes we expect like our adult children to support us when we become widowed. And there's definitely going to be an element of support, but they have their own grief. They have their own grief to work on. And sorry about that. And they have their own grief to work on. And the mom or the dad should maybe not be seeking all of their support in the children, because it's just, they're not going to support you the way that you need. So that's when I say, look to peers, look to other people who are experiencing the same thing or have gone through it.
Right. Exactly. So when you decided to move your state,
yes,
and you decided to set up your coaching practice in the name of Adrian.
Yes.
Yeah, which is so wonderful. And you tell people, a little bit about the work that you do now with people.
I am a certified life coach, but I've turned that towards grief coaching, and I am a certified grief educator. So I see clients one-on-one through Zoom. And yes, the name of my business is Adrian Grief Support. I wanted people to say his name. That's something that, people don't realize. When you're in grief, you want to hear your loved one's name. And it becomes like, oh, don't make her upset. Well, I'm already upset. Don't remind her. That's the funniest one. Don't remind her. Oh, you mean don't remind me about my son who died? I'm pretty sure I'm not going to forget that. So I love hearing his name. And I thought, this is a way that I can, hear his name and say his name, and it can be for a really good cause. So that's why I named it Adrian Grief Support. And yeah, I see clients, and I do lead grief groups online. Yeah.
Wow. It's amazing, Kim. And how's your son doing?
My other son?
Yeah, Adrian.
Yeah, I moved over to be close to him.
Yeah.
Because that was the other thing I realized, is that nothing mattered more to me than love and my family. Nothing. Career, material stuff, the home I'd lived in for so many years. I walked away from a lot of things, and I just wanted to be with my son and my grandson. And so he's really great. He's doing well. He had his own grief to get through. And again, even though I'm a grief educator and a grief coach, I couldn't be his person. I couldn't, because I'm just too close, and he couldn't be my support. So we've gone down this path of grief side by side, but not like this. We've gone side by side, and we'll talk to each other sometimes, turn towards each other, compare, but then we go forward again, side by side on our own paths, because I can't be his grief coach. I'm his mom. So, and he can't be mine. He's my son. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's important, to share that with people as well. And I know also you love animals, and you.
Yeah, I do. I have a zoo. In our house, we have 3 dogs, a cat, a bird, like 350 gallons worth of fish. I have frogs now. Oops, I'm pointing the wrong way. Frogs now. Yeah, animals. Well, like we were saying earlier, I think animals have an incredible healing capacity. They just are they're innocent, and their love is so pure, non-agenda. They don't want to do anything except love us and have a relationship with us. And that can be incredibly healing in grief. And I will say this as well. I lost my dog also after Adrian and John died. And it was devastating, absolutely devastating to me. I had grief and trauma far beyond what I would have expected. Part of that is because when you have a new grief, it brings up all of your old stuff, It just bubbles right up to the surface. But I was also kind of saddened by the responses of people that were like, well, you lost your husband, you lost your son. Well, it's a dog, but that dog was one of the things that kept me going. He was my pillar of support after our other pack members had died. So it was really devastating. I think pet loss is something also that I do pet loss coaching often. And because I think it's so disenfranchised.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Yeah.
My final question for you, Kim, is if you would like to define conscious grief in your own interpretation.
Conscious grief. I think it's feeling everything as it comes openly and allowing it to become part of you. Can I tell you my idea, my vision of what conscious grief is? If you imagine a tree, like a young tree, and there's a bicycle that's been abandoned and it's leaning against it, that's early grief. If you looked there, you would only see the bicycle. You'd see the shape of it, you'd see the color, the size. You really wouldn't notice the tree behind it because the bicycle, the early grief, that's it. That's what's coming out at you. But imagine years and years go by and the tree starts to grow around that bicycle. It starts to make it part of itself. And the bicycle actually, instead of getting rejected or thrown off, it becomes part of the tree's center, part of its growth. And eventually you might not even know it's there because it's just a bicycle shape in the tree. But that's conscious grief. It's allowing yourself to grow around it, allowing the grief to become part of you instead of rejecting it and saying, no, refusal, which is what I did in the beginning. Nope, not going to feel, refusal. Letting yourself feel that grief and grow with it, grow around it, take it with you. It's not always going to look the same. It's not always going to be this bright blue bicycle that, is the first thing you see. It's going to become part of you and it will get softer. It will get gentler. It will change from constant pain into love, where you remember your loved ones with much more happiness than sadness. That's what conscious grief is to me.
Wow, I love that. I haven't had anyone do a vision of it. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thanks for talking with me.
Oh, no, I've loved talking with you. And let's not forget your gift as well for the listeners.
Yeah, if anyone is interested in having a session, free, no obligation, I am really happy to do that for your listeners, for the people who are part of this conscious grief and trying to learn how to grieve in a conscious way. I love it. So yeah, I'm offering a free one-on-one.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kim. That's really generous of you. And it's just, it's been wonderful talking to you and getting to know you. And thank you so much for all your work that you do.
You too. Thank you too. Thank you so much.
Everybody who's been listening. Bye.
Thank you.